Hey, welcome everybody. We're already getting lots of activity in the chat here, so I'm just gonna say hello as a general hi to everyone. I'm not unfortunately able to respond to every single hello. We got lots of people tuning in from all over the place, like all over Canada and it looks like the United States, and that's just fantastic. So thanks everybody for tuning in. It's wonderful to be here. Welcome to Getting Wild About Photography with John Marriott. We're super excited to be here with you all tonight. I'm Jolene. I am here on behalf of McLean Camera. I'm joined tonight by Canon Canada's Russell Brown and, of course, John Marriott. Before we dive in, I'm just going to do a little bit of housekeeping, and this will also just give everyone a chance to log on, and there's a little less of a rush to dive in right at 7 o'clock. First of all, there are a lot of viewers on tonight, so there's a chance that we might get a lot of engagement and questions, as I'm sure you've all already realized, as I can see you've already realized. If you do have any questions or comments, you can go ahead and throw them in the chat. We're going to do our best to make sure that all of your questions get answered. If not in the presentation itself, then in the Q&A at the end, so, hang on if you do have some questions specific to John that he doesn't get to in the presentation. You will have a chance to ask them at the end. I'll be monitoring the chat, and so we'll go through them at the end and make sure that we get to all of them. If by chance you think of something that you want to ask either John or Russell or myself after tonight's presentation, you can reach out to McBain, and I'll do everything I can to get your question answered. We can be found on pretty well all social media platforms under @McBain Camera, or you can email me at workshop@mcbaincamera.com. So just a little quick bit of housekeeping. And as I mentioned, I am joined tonight by Russell Brown from Canada. I'm going to hand things off to you, Russell. Do you have a couple comments to make here on behalf of Canon?
Yeah, I mean, obviously great to be with both of you again for another awesome live stream. I want to welcome everybody who's on, excuse me, on the live stream tonight, whether you've been Canada or US or elsewhere. Certainly, if you haven't already, put in the chat where you're from. We always like seeing that, and there is a wide variety of different people here. Of course, this event and myself, I'm from Canon Canada specifically, so I do just want to let all of you know that Canon Canada does have our 50th anniversary promotions going on currently, and our Black Friday pricing is currently available. So for those of you who are in the States, obviously that is something that would be different. But for those of you here in Canada, obviously McLean Camera is part of that promotion. For those of you who are joining us tonight and signed up using your Eventbrite account, or put in your email addresses into Eventbrite, you'll be receiving an email from McBain that will have an exclusive offer for those of you who are joining us. That would be in addition to anything that's going on with the 50th anniversary and Black Friday. So just have an eye open for those emails. Obviously, if you're here on this call tonight, you have an interest in photography, and we want to make sure that obviously those of you who are interested have a good opportunity to upgrade or join and get your first camera if you want as well. Anyways, regardless, we'll talk more about that later before the Q&A. I know I'm excited for the presentation tonight. I know John's excited. I know Jolene's excited. I'm sure all of you are excited. So I'm going to stop talking now. I'm going to hand it back to Jolene, and we'll chat a little bit later as well.
Awesome. Thanks, Russ. And I'm sure everyone is ready for the two of us to take off and let John do his thing. John Marriott is by far one of our favorites here at McBain. He's a wildly accomplished and prolific photographer. He's well-traveled and well-versed in nature and wildlife photography, with books and greeting cards of exceptional quality, as well as a wildlife photography tour company, leading tours and workshops to educate and inspire new photographers. I mean, honestly, I could just sit here and just list off all of the reasons why y'all are tuning in tonight. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to hand things off now. Russell and I are going to disappear shortly from the screen. Welcome, John. Thank you for coming. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, Russ, and thanks, Jolene. Great to see everybody. Nice to have such a huge crowd join us online here for this presentation. So I'm going to dive right in because I got a lot to cover. So we're going to be, it's called Getting Wild About Photography with Canon's mirrorless cameras. And before I get into it and tell you what I'm talking about, I want to tell you a little bit about me. I started taking pictures seriously back in 1993. with my mom's Pentax ME Super Camera and her Vivitar lenses. I turned professional in the year 2000. So I'm very fortunate. This is my 24th year as a full-time professional nature wildlife photographer. First camera that I bought that I actually paid for was a Canon EOS A2E back in 1993. And then I had a pair of Canon EOS 3 bodies, which interestingly enough are almost identical looking to the current R5 and R6s that are out. So it's kind of cool how almost 30 years later, Canon has come back to that look. First lenses I bought were an 80-200 2.8 and a 300 f4 way back in 1993. And I'm going to show you a couple of images I took with them. And this is kind of to illustrate to you guys that even if you don't have the money to buy the best gear out there, you can still take some shots that can do really well over time. This elk image of mine has made me over $30,000 in my career. Still sells. It's been on the cover of Canadian Geographic, calendars, all sorts of different things. And same thing with this black bear. It's been on the cover of one of my books, all sorts of different stuff. Made me about $15,000 in my image, and it was just shot with a 300 f4 that literally back in the day I think cost like $600. Now, having said that, I'm now going to spend the entire rest of the talk convincing you that it is well worth your time to part with your hard-earned money to go out and buy mirrorless cameras and get new lenses. And I'm going to tell you why. That's what half of this talk is about. So first big telephoto lens that I bought was back in 1994. It was a 500 f4.5. I spent $8,000 on it. That was the most I'd ever spent on anything in my entire life up to that point, including university, vehicles, all that kind of stuff. So let's take a look at what I started with. Well, when I started out, I was completely addicted to the big and the furry. I would actually pass up the most glorious sunrises and sunsets just to go around the next corner and see what was up there, because I thought, you know, maybe there's a bear, maybe there's something else out there. This, by the way, is the illustrious Frank the Tank. Those of you that have my Tall Tales Long Lenses book have read all about Frank, one of the grumpiest bears alive. As my career went on, I started to broaden my portfolio. I started to go out to endangered species, go out into the prairies, just to expand my portfolio as much as I could beyond the big and the furry. Eventually started doing birds, getting into landscapes. I was getting asked so much for landscapes of Lake Louise and Jasper and things like that, that it just made sense to start photographing them. And I even got into stock photography for quite a while, photographing myself, models a little bit, but everything's still outdoors in nature. In the end, though, I've returned to wildlife. That's pretty much all I shoot now. Here and there, I'll do a few landscapes, but it's my true passion. And it's led me to some pretty amazing places. I've been just about everywhere in Canada, from coast to coast, all the way out to the East Coast, doing puffins and humpback whales and gannets and all that kind of stuff. All the way to the West Coast. I've spent a lot of time on the West Coast, up and down the coast, doing orcas, humpback whales again, gray whales, sea wolves, spirit bears. There's a Kermode bear. I've mentioned the sea wolves already. I've been up to the Arctic 9 different times, done polar bears, muskox, even done the big caribou migrations up there. Lots of time out in the prairies, as I mentioned. So red foxes, swift foxes, burrowing owls, prairie rattlesnakes, all that kind of stuff. Just some amazing species out there that we don't find elsewhere in Canada. And then through it all, I've come back to where I live, which is in Canmore, Alberta. And my backyard is right here. This is a half hour from my house. And I really can't go wrong just stepping out and photographing in my own backyard all the amazing creatures that are ranging from the elk and the deer and the mountain goats and the sheep all the way to the big predators like the lynx and the cougars and the wolves and bears and stuff that you're going to see a ton of pictures of today as I go through all these different cameras that I've tested out. So let's talk about what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to tell you what I'm going to tell you. So first of all, I'm going to go over all the different cameras that I've tried out from Canon in the new mirrorless lineup. So that includes the R3, R5, R6, and the R7, although I am also going to mention the R10, the R50, the R100, as I go through some of these notes and primarily I'm going to focus on the R5, R6, and R7 because I think that's what fits the market the best for sort of the hobby, amateur, semi-professional wildlife photographer, which is, I think, what most of you are out there. So I'm going to talk about advantages, disadvantages, comparisons between all of them, what you should be looking at as a beginner versus more an advanced photographer, an in-depth review of just all the different stuff that they can do within wildlife photography that may be different than some of the cameras you're used to, the 5D, 7D series, and so on. So we're going to look at the features and then at the actual images that I've taken with these cameras. We're also going to look at some RF lenses that I've been able to use, the 70-200, 2.8, 100 to 500, which I use extensively, the 600 f4, 600 f11, and the 800 f11. And also hint a bit at some of the lenses that are also out that I haven't gotten to try yet, or ones that are just coming up here that are coming out in the next few weeks. And then after all of that, so you got to stay awake through all that where I'm talking about all the different cameras and lenses. And then we get into the tips and techniques to become a better wildlife photographer. So that's going to be the whole second half of the presentation. And then when we finish all that, it's going to be a Q&A with myself and Russell and Jolene, where you guys can ask questions, tech questions about the gear, wildlife photography technique, tips, just basically anything you want to get into with us at the end of the talk. So let's dive in. So the camera that I use the most, and I own two of them, is a Canon EOS R5. Now I've also gotten to test the R6 quite extensively. This is what they look like if you don't already have one. Now I know we've got a wide range of users here. Some of you already have these cameras. Some of you haven't even gone to the mirrorless side yet. So I'm going to try and cover sort of the full scope of it for everybody. So an overview of these cameras, I'm just going to cover the main features, some of the differences with the older cameras, some of those advantages and disadvantages. And really for me, I want to go into why I think these mirrorless cameras are must-haves and game changers now in wildlife photography. And I really do believe that. I'm not just saying that as some kind of selling point. I get no additional money from Canon for pitching them, for doing any of this. I am a Canon ambassador. But I'm saying this because I actually think it's going to make you guys better wildlife photographers. So you're going to see that as I go through this, what these advantages are and what these must-have features are. I'm going to compare it to all the old cameras. So the 72, the 5D series, the 1DX series, even things like the 60D, the 80D, the 90D, some of the really older cameras that people used and may still be using. And then look at the differences between all these different new ones, the R3s all the way to the R10, R50, and so on. And I'm even going to look at performance with some of your older lenses, the EF lenses, if some of you are thinking about switching over or have partially switched over. So from appearance, R5, R6, R7 all look really similar. It's the R3 that looks a bit different. And then R7 and R10, you start getting a bit smaller in the overall size. They're small and lightweight, but they're not delicate. They are still weather sealed and have all those features that you used to have in the 5D and 7D series. You'll see there's a couple little differences between the R5 and R6 in just the top, the screen versus the dial, the little additional LCD screen. Here's a great visual of what you're looking at size-wise between the old 1DX series, which was what all the pros like myself had back in the day. So this was like 5 years ago. Then the EOS R3, which is currently the flagship kind of sports wildlife camera. And then the R5, which is the overall flagship camera for Canon right now. And like I said, that's the one that I own two of. And you can see size-wise, it's a huge size and weight difference versus the 1DX series that I used to tote around with me. So when I go traveling now, there's a big difference in my overall weight. In terms of what makes them shine for wildlife photography, it's the sensors and the resulting image files, which you're going to see a lot of examples here tonight. A best-in-class autofocus system that includes this amazing new face and eye detection that really is groundbreaking. I can't rave enough about it, but I'm going to a lot tonight. And very quick and effective mechanical and electronic shutters that basically, without getting into the details of those, allow you to go from anywhere from like 3, 4, 5 frames per second, all the way up to 30 frames per second. So you're capturing every little bit of action. So the sensors themselves, if you look at the red outline around this, you'll see that there's just a tremendous number now of autofocus area zones in these new R5s and R6s and R7s, and even the R10 for that matter, and the R3. So I'm going to just say R5 and R6 for now, and you can just assume, unless I say otherwise, that it covers all the other cameras too. But one of the great things is now you have autofocus coverage throughout almost your entire viewfinder, which you never used to have with the older cameras. You had to move around your autofocus point, and then it was very limited where you could move it to. So for instance, in this shot here, I didn't actually have to do anything different other than move my autofocus point down to where this bear is. On the old cameras, you simply wouldn't have been able to move it that low and that far to the left. So that included the 1DX series, the 7Ds, the 5Ds, all that kind of stuff. You simply couldn't move your autofocus point that far down. Here's another great example where this was using eye tracking in this, where I had it on the bear and it just follows the bear right out of what would have been out of the frame on the older cameras. Again, you wouldn't have been able to move the autofocus point far enough over for it to continue tracking that animal as it ran away. And what's happening here is a park warden is actually shooting it with a rubber bullet to get it off the road. So it's trying to scare it off the road. So the R5 in particular, which is the flagship one I was talking about, is 45 megapixel full frame, best parent resolution in EOS history, and it's fantastic for the croppability. And I crop it all the time. So I'm going to give you a good example of that. This is the very first day I got an R5 in my hands. I went up to Jasper in the spring 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago now, and just went looking for wildlife. And just first thing I found was a little herd of elk with a bunch of calves. Took this shot and I thought, oh, okay, let's see what I can do with this, see if I can turn it into something interesting. Because normally, it's not every wildlife photographer's dream to have a butt sticking into your photos. So let's take a look at the actual original image. So this is it at 100%. You'll notice my settings up in the top left-hand corner there. 1-800 at f8. This is 500 millimeter with the 100 to 500 lens on the R5 at ISO 2500. So you should be able to see on your screen here the noise. Now it's nice and sharp, but you should be able to see noise in the background there, in particular on the greens and in the shadows and so on. So we're going to see what we can do with this file. I'm going to not only crop it very heavily, but I'm also going to see what I can do with that noise. So again, here's the original image, and now I'm going to crop in on it. So that's the crop that I'm interested in. So I have actually, if I go back again, I've actually cropped in almost 50% of the image away from that. So I've got about 22 megapixels left here, which is still a ton. When you consider the original 5D came out with 12 megapixels. So now I've got 22 megapixels, and now I'm going to run it through run it through Topaz denoise or Lightroom denoise. In this case, I did it in Topaz. And let's go look at 100% view after it's been cropped down to this size and take a look at the amazing sharpness and the lack of noise anywhere in this image. And that's ISO 2500. So you can see right off the bat here where you get a huge leap, a huge advantage over the 5D and 7D series in the past. It's excellent ISO performance. I would say it's close to what you got in that 5D4, which was 30 megapixels, but it's a 45 megapixel file. So you've got a much bigger file that you can crop with, or that you can enlarge much bigger after you've done some noise reduction on it. So the biggest that I have currently printed any of these R5 files, I have a brand new one coming out on a Rome bus in Banff, and it's going to be 18 feet long. And it is, I've seen the proof of it, and it is absolutely incredible, the sharpness. You can walk up to like 2 feet away from it and it looks sharp, which is pretty incredible. I regularly shoot the R5 ISO 2500 to 3000. I push it quite often to 5000 to 6400, and I have pushed it as high as 20,000 in ISO and still gotten usable files after doing noise reduction on it. So that's pretty amazing when you think about it. Especially compared to some of the old cameras. here's a sample shot. This image, just to give you a little preview, I have actually been awarded in the Wildlife Photographer of the Year. On November 29th, I will be announcing this publicly, that this image is in the People's Choice Awards for Wildlife Photographer of the Year. It's one of 25 images that's been chosen internationally. I shot this with the R5 and my EF 500 at ISO 5000, and I want to show you what it looks like at 100% after noise reduction. It's absolutely razor sharp and not a hint of noise in there anywhere. And that's an ISO 5000 image that, that's been processed. So these R5s really do produce just spectacular images. Let's talk about the R6 for a second, because you now step down in sensor size, but you're still full frame. This is 20 megapixels. You get cheaper. You save over $1,000 in the actual overall price as you go to the R6. It's based on the 20 megapixel sensor in the 1DX3. It's excellent ISO performance, even better than the R5, because you've got a smaller overall sensor. Sensor's actually the same size, but the pixels are smaller or bigger, right? Whatever. Anyways, better ISO performance. I'm confusing myself here. I regularly shot the R6 at ISO 5000 to 6000 as a baseline, and pushed it up 10,000, 20,000, even did a couple images at 30,000 that ended up being okay with noise reduction on them. So that's just spectacular ISO performance, particularly for wildlife. So here's a couple examples. Here's it at ISO 5000. This is without noise reduction. So full 100% view of an image without noise reduction. This is straight out of Lightroom, just a screenshot. Wonderfully sharp. And as you can see, there's almost no noise reduction even to be done on this image, little tiny bit. So one of the real advantages of these mirrorless cameras, whether you go from the R3 all the way up to the R50, is how fast you can shoot. So the R5 and R6 in particular, 12 frames per second for the R5, up to 20 when you go into electronic mode. So you can literally just freeze frame by frame and then go in and pick out the one that you want. I literally have this sequence of pumas from Patagonia had the jaw just slowly opening as it yawned, and I had every single shot and I could just pick the exact one that I wanted out of that sequence. You can take, whatever, you got an animal moving, you can just pick whatever leg movement you want in there, because you've got so many different images to choose from. Now, one of the game-changing features is the animal detection autofocus. Excuse me for a second there. So this is modeled after dogs and cats in particular, infused zoo animals, birds put into there. So it does body detection, face detection, and eye detection. Now, it works better in some animals than others. I found it works really well in wolves, bears, as long as it's not a black bear, birds, any of the canids. It does not work particularly well in a black bear, a moose, things like that, where you have to go back to the regular ways of doing autofocus. However, you're still dealing with a far superior autofocus system, just overall, than you were in any of the 5D, 7D, 60D, all that kind of stuff back in the day. So about 50% of the time I use this animal detection mode. And then in the rest of the time, I switch back to normal, just moving my autofocus point around or using a zone of autofocus points. So I'm going to get into that stuff a little later in the talk when I get into the tips and techniques for wildlife photography. In particular, we're going to talk about action in wildlife photography. So speaking of action, here's the eye auto detection in progress. This is the R6 with the 100 to 500. This was on a day where I was actually out with Russell from Canon, Canada, who's on the call with us here tonight. And I was laying down on the pavement. This fox went racing by us, and it was just firing away, just trying to keep the fox in the frame. And it was incredible to me, the autofocus job that it did on this whole sequence as it walked by. So you can see, look where the eyeball is right now in this frame. Now, back in the 5D, 7D, all those other series, you simply wouldn't have been able to get the autofocus point up to where this fox is right now. You would have just been trying to focus on the shoulder, more in the center of the frame. But take a look at just how sharp this is with this eye auto detection on. It's just incredible for tracking. That, by the way, is a pair of ground squirrels. Sorry for the little bit of gore there, but I like to show those sometimes. It does a great job on birds in flight. I suck at birds in flight, and I know that's a weird thing for a professional wildlife photographer who's been doing this for 24 years to say, but this has made it so much easier for me. All I got to do is keep the animal in the frame, and it does the rest. It tracks it all over the place wherever it is in the frame. So pretty amazing at that. And you just basically hold down the shutter button and let it do the tracking for you. Again, you can go way down in the bottom of the frame. It's excellent with things like silhouettes for doing the body detection. Great for stuff like this when you're floating by in a boat. This is out on my Chilcotin bear tours, and you can just place the animal where you want in the frame and get whatever background you're interested in and fire away, and it takes care of the autofocus for you. It's also excellent at picking up stuff very quickly. So eyeball pops out from behind a tree and it just immediately recognizes that eyeball and focuses right on it. Even when you've got things like snowflakes flying around and trees all in the way and so on. It just does a wonderful job. Something that you simply wouldn't have been able to do instantaneously on the older cameras. You would have had to move the autofocus point, and you might have missed that moment in moving it with just that split second it takes to move the autofocus point and then have it focus. Now, the regular autofocus, not the eye detect, but just the regular, is still, even as you're moving those autofocus points around, it's still better than what you were dealing with the older series, other than maybe the 1DX series. So it's extremely reliable and fast. This is where I've been using my autofocus points, selecting the animal and focusing. Now, I do not use eye detect on a shot like this because the camera doesn't know which of the cougar or the kitten to focus on. It also might even focus on the branch in between. So that's where I use an autofocus point for this. I go back to the old method and let the camera do the work once I've selected, put the autofocus point on the cougar that I want to be the central, which was the mother cougar. And I wanted that to be the main subject that was in focus. This one, I didn't use the eye detect because this was actually quite a low light situation. It was having trouble picking up the eyeball. So I used a single autofocus point and put it right on the face of the bear cub as we were drifting by on the river. And it does an excellent job of picking that up. And then here, again, using the eye detect, it would have had trouble picking up the eye here. And I'd already noticed this when I was photographing the wolverine earlier. This is a wild wolverine, by the way, not baited, not called in. I do everything ethically. So this was a natural situation where it had found a deer carcass, and this was dragging it away at this point. Now for this, I had to use autofocus points again. I moved the point right onto the wolverine's head, and as it's dragging the carcass back, just let the autofocus do its job, continuously tracking with that autofocus point locked right onto the head of the wolverine. Now the weather sealing and durability of these cameras is excellent. The R3 is completely weather sealed. I don't want to say that you could drop it in a river, but you probably could and might get away with it. I don't recommend that, but the R5 and R6 are great just for regular weather. You know, so a little bit of rain, a little bit of snow, you're pretty much fine and that kind of stuff. The batteries don't last as long as the old 5D and 7D series do, but they still do pretty well. You still get 1,000, 1,200 shots per battery if you're taking care of it. Works great in the rain or cold. You do still need your rain covers and things like that. You know, works in the fog. This is foggy, rainy day. This is rainy day. You can actually see the rain falling in the background there. This was Brutus, the bear in the Kutzmatine, which is another place I do photo tours to. This was the Banfftown wolf pack a couple of winters ago. This day was minus 32. And I only had one battery with me. I wasn't actually expecting to run into a wolf pack. I was out tracking a cougar and just had one battery and a camera with me and cruising along, and ended up doing 4 hours of photography, almost 500 images and about 60 4K videos all on one battery, and I still had almost 50% left at the end of it in minus 32 weather. So they still do really, really well in the cold. Great 4K video on these, and I know a lot of photographers have not been getting into video. I've started to get more and more into it, just because it's so easy now on both the R3, the R5, and the R6, and the R7 for that matter. You have really easy ways to get into video. In fact, on the R5 and R6, you can just hit a little red button and it instantly plays video. So hopefully this is going to stream for everybody. I've just hit play now. This is 5 wolves that we saw in my Jasper photo tour just a couple of weeks ago, which was a pretty awesome experience. So hopefully everybody was able to see that video. So now I'm going to make your mind spin like crazy, because I'm going to just start talking about features of all these cameras, and I'm going to start comparing them. The R7 or the R10, which is just sort of I call it the baby R7. The R7 itself is smaller than the R5 and the R6, and it's actually almost too small. When I first grabbed it, I'm a pretty big guy. I'm almost 6'3", and I wear extra large glove size, so I have big hands. When I first grabbed the R7, I was like, holy cow, this is like a toy camera. But because it's just so crazy light, but it's still got all the crazy features and everything. Now, both the R7, the R10, and the R50, and Russ will have to correct me, but I'm guessing the R100 as well. I haven't seen the R100 yet, but these are all basically like the R7, then the R10 is a baby version of it, then the R50 is a baby version of that, and then the R100 is a baby version of that. So it's all the way down to right at the entry level. I think the R100 is like $700, all the way up to the R7, which is like $2,000. These are all crop cameras, so it means they have a 1.6 crop effect. So any lens that you put onto them, for instance, if you put the 100 to 500 onto them, it becomes a 160 to 800, and yet you don't lose any light. You just have a smaller sensor. So what that means is you have 32 megapixels in the R7, for instance, so it's actually nice and big. You can crop it quite a bit, but it's not quite as good in ISO as the R5, and it's definitely not as good as the R6. So back in the day, I used to have 2 5D4s and a 7D2 so that I had that crop camera. And I actually I just tested out the R7 last week, which I'm going to talk about in a second. And I'm actually probably in the new year here going to have 2 R5s and an R7, so that I do have that extra reach when I need it when something's really far away. Same autofocus system as the R6 and the R7. Then as you go down R10 and as you sort of drop down the list there, R50 and R100, the autofocus just doesn't have quite as many features and quite as many autofocus points and stuff. So it's the R5 is the best overall, and then you slowly drop down a bit. 15 and 30 frames per second, so it's just superb for wildlife in the R7. I already said it's smaller and lighter, and then you see my notes there. So let's take a look at what the R7 actually does. Now, this was not with the R7. This was with my cell phone last week. So I went out looking for wolves with donors to the EXPOSED Wildlife Conservancy. Some of you may have seen it on my Facebook page. We had 8 donors that donated $1,000, and they got to come out with me for a day tracking wolves. And we came achingly close. Every single day we found fresh tracks, which I actually wasn't expecting. So that was wonderful. We heard wolves howl. We found fresh scat. We basically did everything except for see a wolf. So I did not get to put the R7 to the test on a wild wolf, but we did find a couple other things, thankfully. This is pine grosbeak, female pine grosbeak. So I want to show you what this looks like. This is with the R7. Again, 100% view, unedited. So you can see nice and sharp. You can see my settings up on the top left there and what lens I was using and so on. And you can see the noise very clearly here. It's more noticeable than it was at 100% in that R5 file that I showed you earlier. But this is still really, really easy to fix up with software. It does a wonderful job still of doing all the animal tracking and so on. Again, you can see you can put animals way down in the corner, way up in the corner, wherever you want, and the tracking still locks in and follows along. So this was with the body detection, eye detection turned on for the animals specifically. So this is a coyote. And then I wanted to show you this image. So we had a pine marten encounter. You can see my settings up here, and this is just the raw image when we first took it, and you can see, okay, this is a troublesome image. I've had to go pretty high ISO to get enough shutter speed to freeze this pine marten. There's a really bright background, and yet it's in shade in the foreground. You can see that processing wide, this is going to be a bit of a tricky one to work with. So I took it into Lightroom. I hit the auto button, which is the first thing I always do in Lightroom. And then I just adjusted a couple things a little bit with the contrast, and I took out a bit of blue and cropped it a tiny bit. And this is the image that I ended up with. And now I want to show you, then I ran it through a noise reduction, and I want to show you what it looks like at 100%. And this is a 12 by 18, 300 DPI file. So I could print this. No, not this is, again, this is 100% view of it. But the full file back to here, I could quite easily print at about 40 by 60 and still get a nice sharp image. So the R7 also does a wonderful job. So those of you that are really into wildlife photography, I would highly recommend having an R7 as a backup, as your primary camera if you love that crop factor from the 7D series, or even the R10 if you can't afford the R7. You're not giving up much going from the R7 to the R10. A little bit autofocus wise, a little bit frames per second. It's all as you step down and go cheaper and cheaper. You're obviously giving up some features. If money is no object, I would say have two R5s and an R7. So comparing all these different cameras, the key differences for wildlife photography, R5 versus R6 versus R7, you're looking at 45 megapixels versus 20 versus 32. The buffer fills the fastest on the R5. That's because it's the biggest file. However, I've actually got around that, but I now shoot everything on the R5 in CRAW, so compressed RAW. You can go Google it. I'm not going to go too much into it, but I can now take about 15 seconds worth of images straight before I hit the buffer on the R5s. You can see some other notes that I've made there. I'm not going to go too much into depth, obviously the crop cameras. And then the big one is just the price and the weight. Like I said, if you can afford them, the R5s are just friggin' amazing. Like, have 10 of them if you can afford them. Well, maybe not 10. That's a little overboard, but now to step back a little bit and talk about one camera I haven't talked about yet very much, and that's the R3. So this is what Canon considers the big workhorse. So this is the one that the sports photographers are all using in the NHL, the NFL, things like that. And it does have some practical applications for wildlife photography, particularly if you're one of the people who likes a bigger camera and you love that 1DX series, because this is a bigger, it fits your hand better, and it fires super fast, 30 frames a second. It's a bit of a smaller sensor, but it's superb ISO performance. You can shoot up to ISO 20,000 very easily, very usable files. And it's got that same R5, even a slightly better autofocus system overall in the EOS R3. So just fantastic eye control and all that stuff. Not as croppable though as the R5 or R7 and all that stuff. So here's a sample of an image with the R3. I got to test it for a couple days out in the Chilcotin in British Columbia on a sockeye salmon run with grizzlies. And this was the kind of stuff that they were looking for. This was actually a test I did for Canon USA, which was pretty cool to get to do a shoot for them. Some other really key things about the new, now this goes for all mirrorless, or a lot of this goes for all mirrorless cameras, compared to the older, the 5D, the 1DX, the 7D, the 60D, all that kind of stuff. One is that you have silent shutter mode. And this is just a total game changer for photographing at nests, at dens, things like that. Faster frames per second than anything you could get in the past, even with the 1DX series. Better image quality than you've ever seen before. I mean, you saw some of those images now, even at 100%, just glorious image quality. You can print them just monstrously now if you want to get into that and do big prints and stuff like that. Best autofocus Canon's ever done. Amazing image stabilization, combining both the in-body stabilization with the lens stabilization. Now, when you do get down, that's the R3, R5, R6, and R7. When you get past the R7 into the R10, R50, and R100, you do not have the in-body stabilization anymore. You're just relying on the lens stabilization. And I believe that's correct, but Russ can correct me at the end if that's not true. Excellent ISO in that R3, in the mirrorless, is better than anything that Canon has produced before, other than maybe the 1DX3, which I'm sure most of you did not even have because it was like an $8,000 camera. So basically, this is just mind-blowingly better than anything you've had before if you haven't gone to mirrorless yet. Fantastic video, as I mentioned, just click a button and boom, it starts doing video. But you can also do things like slow-mo video, all kinds of stuff like that. It's good battery life. It's not quite as good as the older cameras, but it's still really good. And it works seamlessly with all the old EF lenses. So if you've spent 15 grand in the past on a big EF 500 f4 and you want to keep using it, you can. So I'll show you some samples of that in a second. Basically, bottom line, if you can afford these lenses, as I've said, or these cameras, I would definitely recommend going mirrorless. There's just too many new features that make wildlife photography easier. Now, it doesn't make it bomb-proof. You still have to think, and you know, that's why I'm going to go into a half hour at the end of this presentation on all the tips and techniques to make you a better wildlife photographer, because you can't just point and hope that it's going to do everything for you. I'm going to show you very clear examples where that doesn't work. So you still have to have some talent and work at your skill and your technique. So I want to talk about lenses now very quickly. The 100 to 500, the 600 f11, 800 f11, the 600 f4. And I'm going to just do a quick shout out before I even get into these lenses. There's a brand new Canon lens that is coming out in like 3 weeks. And Canon actually tried to get it to me. I hate to mention this to everybody, but I leave for Mexico for 5 weeks on Monday. And I know you're all feeling terribly sorry for me right now that I've broken that news to you. But Canon tried to get me one of these new 200 to 800 lenses to test out. It's kind of an entry-level intermediate lens. From everything I've read about it and everything Canon's told me about it so far, it's an incredible price point. When I saw the price, I was blown away. So this is something I think all of you that are entry-level to intermediate amateur photographers are gonna, it's an amazing lens, and I would highly recommend it without even having tested it yet. I think I can already highly recommend knowing what the features are and the weight and the price and so on. Anyways, into the lenses that currently exist that are already out. I love my 100 to 500. I used to have the 100 to 400 EF lens, the version 2, which was an awesome lens. I have upgraded to this just because it's a little bit better autofocus overall. And gives you that extra 100 meters of range of telephoto. It's an f7.1 instead of an f5.6, but you get that extra 100 millimeters, which does make a difference in a lot of situations. It's small, it's lightweight. It's actually even lighter than that old 100 to 400 was. So you can see weight of the old 5D Mark IV with the 100 to 400 compared to the new R5 with the new 100 to 500. And you actually save a bit of weight, which can be very essential nowadays for those of you that travel and go on photo trips and stuff. Because, you know, airlines are getting tighter and tighter on this weight. And so to be able to scale down and save some weight is a huge thing. So here's some shots with 100 to 500. This was, again, with the very first day I ever tested one. That was that little elk herd. It's a fantastic lens for if you hike a lot. I can't rave enough about it because it's nice and light and small, and yet still gives you all that reach that you would get with a 500 f4. You just don't get quite the same bokeh, quite the same blurred background. But you can still see it does a nice blurred background. This is muskox in Nunavut, pumas in Patagonia. And then I've also got to test the new RF lenses, which are aimed at beginner wildlife photographers. And I've actually had quite a few people on my workshops and stuff that have shown up with these. And for the price, they're fantastic. You know, they're a kind of a middle of day lens. You need to have some light to use them. because they're fixed at f11, so they don't let a lot of light in. They're not for early mornings or late evenings, but very, very affordable. They're compact. They're extremely light. They're literally like holding up a bottle of water, and they retract. The lens zooms back in, so you can see the actual size of them compared to a 500 ml bottle of water. They are tiny. And actually, there's them compared to the big versions, the 600 f4, 800 5.6. You can see the price points. There's a pretty huge difference there. And they actually produce really nice images. I was actually surprised at the quality of the images that they could produce. Still produce nice colors, good image quality on the R5 or the R6 or the R7. I did not get to, I've never tested an R10 or R50, but I assume they'd be fantastic on those as well. Although right now with this 200 to 800 coming out, I'd probably potentially even lean there if you've got that little extra bit of money to spend on that when it comes out in a couple of weeks. So here's another example of shooting with that 800 f11, and here's 100% unprocessed view of that. So this is straight from Lightroom. You can see all my settings there, and really quite lovely sharp images. Now the Canon EF lenses I've mentioned still work just great. Autofocus still works as it would on your old DSLRs, so it works great on the mirrorless. All you need is a little thin adapter that I think it costs like $50 or something like that. Still the exact same sharpness. In fact, with the new autofocus, you'll get way more sharp images. So these are all with my 500 f4, the EF lens with the adapter on the R5. And some of these are with, this one's with the teleconverter, 1.4 times teleconverter as well. So lovely sharp images, really no complaints there at all. Okay. So that is it for all of the gear talk. How we're doing time-wise. Okay, we're a little over time, but that's okay. You guys are just going to have to put up with me a little bit extra long tonight. So I want to now talk about some tips and techniques. Hopefully those of you that are out east have managed to stay awake this long. This is just some of my things that I think will help you become a better wildlife photographer. Some of them are pretty basic tips and techniques, and then I get into some pretty advanced stuff. So we're going to cover all of this in like 20 to 25 minutes, I hope. So bear with me here. So tip number one, embrace the elements. Now, this one is more aimed at the beginner and the entry level, the amateur photographer. Those of you that, that we're coming up to winter here, and it's going to start getting ugly. The blizzards hit. If you're out on the coast, the torrential downpours start. And those are the days I love because there's no other wildlife photographers out there. -40, snowing. I can guarantee you one thing, and that is that I am out from about an hour before dawn till about an hour after dusk. I absolutely love big storms, going out, photographing anything in the rain, freezing cold, the snow, whatever, it doesn't matter. So I just want to say, embrace the elements. That's when you really get some wonderful shots, and it's when a lot of wildlife photographers stay home. So if you can manage to be out there, this was shot in -43 degrees Celsius on a polar bear trip in southern Nunavut. So, like I said, I just love being out there. Get yourself some electric gloves, an electric heated vest, electric socks. Those are all things that I own and use all the time. Number two, learn how to handle different types of action. And we're going to get into some fairly advanced stuff here. So I'm going to talk about basically 6 different situations that you can run into with action in wildlife photography. So hang on for a sec. Got to wet my whistle here. Okay. Now, do not bother writing these down, or at least don't go and Google them, because I've just made all these up. So we're going to talk about plain old action, moving/flight action, reactionary spot photography, etc., etc. You're going to find out what all these things are as I go through each one by one, and the settings that you need to use to photograph them. Now, before we get into that, for a lot of these, you're going to be able to use the eye detection, the animal tracking when you're with the new mirrorless. Now, the rest of it is going to apply to anybody, even those of you that are still back in the old DSLRs. And I just pulled up an old image here of basically what autofocus points look like. So when I talk about a single autofocus point, that's this, as you go down on the left in the middle, that's a single autofocus point, just that little square. And then as you go down in the bottom right, that's a zone autofocus. So as I talk about all these different things, just take a quick mental note of what I mean by single autofocus, autofocus expansion, and zone autofocus, because I'm going to talk about each of those for some of these types of action, some of these situations you're going to find yourself in. So first and foremost, plain old action. So this is an animal moving around, but it's just on the same plane. So maybe it's a bear walking across sideways from you. Maybe it's a beaver chewing on a stick, things like that. So fast shutter speed, 1,000th of a second or more if you can. Any action, basically, you need 1,000th of a second or more. You can use continuous tracking / servo, or you can choose not to. You can just do one-shot mode if you want to. Now, one-shot still means you can continuously shoot. You can still do the high-speed shooting, but it just means you autofocus once, and then you can just leave it in that plane of focus. So I often just use one autofocus point for this, or if it's an animal I know the eye detection is going to work on, like a fox or a coyote, then I'll use the eye detection. And then basically just press the shutter button down and hammer away. So let's look at some examples. So would you use eye detection on a shot like this? This one actually might be tricky because beavers don't have a super noticeable eye. The eye detection would probably work on this in this particular shot, but as soon as that branch starts moving around and the hands are moving around on the beaver, it might pick up different things there. So I personally, when I shot this, used a single autofocus point. I used one shot mode. I focused on the eye and I reframed slightly to put the beaver just down a bit on the left. And then I fired away as the beaver kind of moved around a bit and moved the branch up and down, because the beaver's body itself wasn't moving. It was just the hands and the branch and stuff that were moving. That's why I still needed the fast shutter speed of 1,000th or more for that. Red nape sapsucker poking out of a nest cavity. This was interesting from an ethical perspective. So this was the very last time I ever photographed with a flash, and this was back in 2008. You can actually see the tiny pinprick of flash in the sapsucker's eyeball. I was teaching a workshop, and this was at a nest cavity. And so a couple of things I told people, you know, what you need to do here is as the sapsucker pokes its head out, just focus on that eyeball. So this obviously there was no eye detect back then. So it's using the autofocus point, move it over, frame your shot, and take the shot as it pokes out. But for ethical concerns here, number one, I didn't like how the bird reacted to the flash. And so I told everybody we have 1 minute at the nest cavity, we get set up, we do our shots, and then we leave. And since that time, I've actually gotten even more strict with myself when I photograph at nest cavities like this, where animals can be very sensitive. So anyways, that's just sort of a little of the backstory behind that image. Back to the settings here, you know, you got an elk, you got it moving, it's bugling, but it's in the same plane of focus. So again, you can either use the auto detect, which will work very nicely on this image, picking up that eye. But animals with antlers, you have to be careful. Like if this was a moose, it quite often picks up the antler instead of the eyeball and can then throw your autofocus off slightly from the plane that you want it on. So I often, in this type of situation, will just use a single autofocus point again. This is bears fighting in the Kutzma play fighting. This could be a very tricky one. If you use the eye detect on this one, which bear is the camera going to choose? So oftentimes I switch back to the old system and I'll pick a little zone autofocus and put it on one of the bear's heads and then just fire away. And I definitely use servo for this in case the bear is moving slightly back and forth, closer to the camera and further away from the camera. Closer to the camera and front. I think you guys can see me over on the side there, so you can see me moving back and forth a little bit there. If not, then I just look silly for my own sake there. Moving and flight actions. So this is the second scenario. So this is a bird flying, so they're not on the same plane anymore, or an animal walking towards you, for instance, or diagonally towards you. So you have to use that tracking servo mode. You need the fast shutter speed. You've got to let the camera track the subject. And either you're placing an autofocus zone on the animal's head or on the body, or you're letting the camera do it for you, which in most cases is the easier way to do this now. Especially with these new mirrorless cameras, you just put it on body or face detect for an animal and just let it do the work. And then again, you just fire away. So wolf walking towards you, you just fire away. Bear walking towards you, if the eye's in decent light like this one, you can just fire away. The camera's going to pick up that forehead and that eyeball pretty well on this through the whole sequence. And you can literally just be tracking and just fire. Birds in flight, just keep it in the frame and it is going to track it all over the place. And it is superb at picking out the head ahead of the wings, which is really just wonderful technology now. Short-eared owl. Now, the third type of photography is what I call reactionary spot photography. And this is very, very difficult stuff. So think whale jumping out of the water, where you can't really see where it's going to happen and you have to react, and then it's going to be in one spot. So it's jumping out of the water in one location, and you've got to move your camera over there super quickly and fire. And so you got to be very, very quick with your reflexes. You have to have a super high shutter speed, at least 1,000th. I usually prefer 1,500th or even a 2,000th. And basically, it's a ready aim fire situation. You can use your tracking if you want, or no tracking, because generally it's an animal just leaping up into one plane of focus. So oftentimes I either use the eye tracking if I think it's going to be able to lock on, or I use that zone autofocus. Now, in this particular case with dolphins, I was not using the eye autofocus because I never knew how many dolphins were going to jump out of the water. So instead, I was using a little zone and trying to lock in on a particular dolphin. So this dolphin on the left is actually, it was actually in the middle of the frame, and I cropped it so it's on the left and the other one's in the bottom right. But it was in the dead center when I initially took the shot. So they jump out of the water, you quickly fire your lens over and fire away. I even sometimes start shooting right as I get there, so that it locks onto the animal. So by far the most common use for this type of photography is when you're on the coast, either coast, and you've got something jumping out of the water, because you can't see where it's going to happen. You might get some indication with a bubble net, but even then you don't know, is it going to happen 20 meters back in the bubbles or 40 meters back in the bubbles? So you still have to be aiming and then lock onto it as it comes rising up out of the water. Now, even harder than reactionary spot photography is what I call reactionary moving photography. So this is the same thing. Something just pops into the scene all of a sudden, but it's moving. It's actually like not just jumping up into the air, it's actually moving right across your screen or right across your viewfinder. So think an animal suddenly appearing. Think of this. You're sitting on a creek and you're watching bears, and all of a sudden an eagle flies by above you. Well, if that eagle starts doing that and you see a second eagle and then a third eagle, you might start getting ready for that. And you get your shutter speed way up there, 2,000th, and you get ready to track the subject. You have all your autofocus assist, or you have your eye tracking turned on. And then as soon as you see that eagle coming, you aim up, follow, and fire, and just let the camera do the rest. So let's take a look at a couple examples of that. That can be a bear. All of a sudden, you're photographing it. It's nice and still. It's walking along the edge of the river. Suddenly it darts in diagonally and charges towards a salmon off on the side. And you've got to be ready for that possibility happening, and ready, aim, fire, and follow. Happens with birds all the time, where they're flying through your frame and you've got to, they pop out from behind a tree or behind a bush. All of a sudden they're there. You got to get up there, follow them, and fire along as they come through. And then things like orcas, where you can kind of know where they're going to come up, but they're moving. They're changing. They're not in the same plane of focus like a jumping whale is. and you've got to track them along. So you got to wait till you first see that whale starting to come up, immediately shift your camera over where you see the blow starting to come, and then focus on it and follow it as it comes along through the water. And actually quite tricky to do. This one, again, you probably wouldn't use the eye detection on it because it's most likely not going to, there's no eyeball to see there. There's no body that it thinks it can lock onto. So I generally do a little autofocus zone instead on these. Now, repeat setup photography is a type of action photography where something happens repeatedly over and over again in the exact same spot. So for instance, a fox den and a fox pup keeps popping up right on the same little ledge over and over and over again. So same behavior is repeated. In fact, you can focus on that spot and turn autofocus off if you want to. You can use manual mode because you can actually figure out what are the settings here, and you can do a test shot and go, okay, this is the perfect settings. I want 1/800th or 1/1000th or whatever at f5.6 and ISO 2500. And you can do a test shot and go, that looks great. And then you just sit there and wait. And when the animal goes into the same spot again, you fire away. So for things like birds, you can choose a nice smooth background that you like when you know that it's landing repeatedly in the same place. Same thing, hummingbirds. So lots of great examples of this repeat setup photography where you know it's coming to the same spot over and over, and you just set up for that and find a nice background. And you still have your action settings. And then the final type of action is low light action. And this is one that I am guilty of myself of skipping. This is the end of the day and you're driving home and you're like, well, you know, there's no more light for photography. I'm done. Well, that is when you can actually do all those cool motion blurs and things like that. You crank your aperture up, you get your shutter speed down, and you try your blurs that actually capture that action. So it can be anything from bears running to water running past a bear and kind of creating a scene and showing you, you know, the patience of a bear just waiting there, waiting and waiting and waiting for that salmon to come along. So tips and techniques. My third one, back to sort of a more basic one, and that is use camo to your advantage. I'm sure most of you have seen some of my videos at some point or another where I'm clad in full camo. I love wearing camo. Just be very careful. My running joke is don't wear it to the grocery store or to the gas station. You'll get very weird looks. Unless you're after that, then sure. But it's fantastic for endangered species, threatened species, nests, dens, anything like that, where you need to be very careful about your presence not being detected. So this is for burrowing owl chicks, and they have no idea what they're looking at right now. I've got a full-on camo blanket. I'm actually in my vehicle here, and I got a whole camo blanket draped over the side of my vehicle with just a little hole poking out of the blanket with my lens. And every once in a while, get them to look over, like they glance over at it and fire away. And most of the time, they're just looking around at everything else. It's great for den type stuff, again, where you can't be detected. So this is swift foxes out in southern Saskatchewan. This was my Kootenai wolf project, where it was imperative that I stay completely undetected by the wolves. And you can see here, wolves have, you know, they're no idea that I'm there photographing them. Completely clad in camo, using the wind to my advantage, and using the silent shutter to my advantage as well. And then the final tip, actually, I think I have 5 altogether. How are we doing time-wise? Okay, we're a little over, not too bad. Is that shutter speed is king in wildlife photography. And I'm going to give you a very clear example of that. So with shutter speeds for wildlife, I generally look at about a 1/125th as a minimum. I aim for at least 1/250th to 1/400th. And if I can, I'm always getting 1/500th for action, and I prefer 1,000th or more for action. Now, I don't ignore depth of field, but it is not the most important thing in wildlife photography. It is never the most important thing in wildlife photography. Shutter speed is always the most important. So I want to give you a very clear lesson in what I mean by that. So one of the first workshops I ever taught, going back to 2008, went out and we were photographing loons on a nest, and they had 2 eggs that hadn't hatched yet. And the first egg finally hatched, and the little chick came out, and it was right at the back end of the mother loon, who was still sitting on her nest, sitting on the other egg, keeping the other egg warm, incubating the other egg. And as we were photographing, it was very low light, and the water was really bounding up and down. It was quite windy. And when we got back from that shoot, there were 2 different boats, and I was in one of the boat, and the owner of the tour company I was working for was in the other boat. And I was directing my boat, okay, everybody, keep your shutter speed high. Don't worry about getting them both in focus. We're not going to be able to. We do not have enough light to be able to worry about depth of field right now, to up your f-stop to f11 or f16 to get enough depth of field to get them both in focus. Now, the other boat did not do that. They couldn't hear me over the wind. And the owner actually shot all of his stuff at f16, trying to get them both in focus. And he ended up getting none of them in focus, because this is what the shot actually looked like. You had to choose one or the other. And I'm going to get everybody, just do a little test right now while you're sitting at your desk or sitting at your iPad or in your living room or whatever you're doing right now. Just put your hand up in front of you, pointed away from your screen so that you can see your hand, and put one finger up and just look at that finger. And then notice the background in behind. It's all out of focus. We are totally used to, as human beings, not seeing everything perfectly in focus from your keyboard to 600 meters away. That's totally abnormal. Even in landscape photography, I always think it's weird when everything is perfectly stacked and focused from start to finish. So in wildlife photography, very common for us to see a blurred out background that has other animals that are blurred out a little bit in the background. You do not need to get everything perfectly in focus back there. In fact, it sometimes looks very weird if you do have it all in focus. So that's just my little depth of field. Keep shutter speed as the single most important priority for you. So I personally almost always shoot an aperture priority or manual. Now, I know that sounds backwards to shoot an aperture priority when shutter speed is of primary importance. That is so that I can manage that shutter speed and keep it as high as possible. I'm not going to go too much into that, though, because that's a whole other rabbit hole to go down. So critically important to freeze the action. Low shutter speeds can kill an image. If you're paying too much, and it still happens all the time on my photo tours, where people are just, they accidentally aren't watching their shutter speed and it gets too low, and we're photographing out of a Zodiac or something, and you just don't get any sharp images. So even for stuff, particularly when you're zoomed in and you get fairly close to an animal, shutter speed becomes more and more critical. As you get close to a moving coyote, you have to have a very high shutter speed because that movement is so magnified. Even an animal that's perfectly still is not perfectly still. They're always breathing and heaving. I mean, go watch your cat or dog right now if they're sleeping near you, and you'll see they're constantly moving. So even an animal that seems perfectly still, you still usually need a 2/50th of a second as a minimum. Not always, but usually. Now, having said all of that, if you're in a low light situation and you just simply can't get any more light, then you do it anyways. So this was, I'd gone out very early in the morning, encountered this orcapod. It was myself and a friend in his boat. And we encountered this orcapod going along. And this was back in the 5D days. And I was getting ISO right maxed out to the limit. And all I could get was a 50th of a second. And I was shooting with my 500. And I took about 520 shots. And I got 2 sharp ones. And this was one of them. So even if it seems like you can't get enough shutter speed, you can still try, and you might get a couple of shockers in there. That, by the way, that spirit bear that I took before, where the bear was perfectly still but the water was moving, that was 1/6 of a second. And I took about 400, 500 of those shots to get a couple of sharp ones. Everything else, there was just too much movement in my hand, or the lens was shaking a tiny bit, or whatever. The bear was moving ever so slightly. And that's it for the talk. So thank you to McLean and Canon Canada. And there's all my info if you don't know it. My website, my tours website, and the Wildlife Conservancy that I co-founded. which we're doing all kinds of cool stuff with cougars and wolves and grizzly bears. So check all that out. I am going to now unshare my screen and welcome Russ and Jolene back into it.
Awesome.
Good job, John. That was fantastic. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm in Calgary, you're in Canmore, but it makes me want to get out in the mountains. That's for sure.
Yeah, no problem.
And you probably recognized a few of the shots.
I did. Yes. I mean, John mentioned it in the presentation. I had the privilege back when the R5 and the R6 launched of like spending a day with John. We had an unbelievable amount of luck, actually, because we were driving up and down to Jasper and back. And just the amount of stuff that we saw on that day was really fortunate. And from what I've heard from you, obviously, it's not every day that you see that many grizzlies and black bears. And what else do we see? We saw the golden mantled ground
squirrel, mountain goats, bighorn sheep.
Just crazy.
Red fox. Yeah, it was awesome.
So Jolene's going to we're going to get into the Q&A in a few minutes here. I do want to just mention before we get into it, obviously I talked about at the beginning of the presentation about how Canon Canada's Black Friday sale is going on right now as part of our 50th anniversary promotion. There's a bunch of products that John touched upon, ones that you specifically are using, but also you had made mention of the R100, which is basically our opening beginner R series camera, like lowest price point that allows people to get into the R series and then opens up the world of the RF lenses, etc. I am going to make a mention of those because, as I said, any of you who signed up are going to be getting an email from McLean. The pricing that's going on currently right now is not going to get better on Black Friday weekend. So this is the Black Friday promos right now. John had mentioned the R100. That's like where we start. That's a $699 deal right now. If somebody is looking to get into their first mirrorless camera, really, really nice, 24 megapixels, still shoots it really, really fast, but has a really great autofocus system. As you start moving your way up the lineup, things do get more expensive, but you get more features. So R50 is currently $949. That's where you start getting the articulating screen and the touch screen on the back. Again, a 24 megapixel sensor, but again, a little bit faster in terms of frame rate, better digital processor as well. The R10, which John had mentioned, that one can come in a kit. That's $1149 currently. The R7, which is where you start seeing the the in-body image stabilization, the 32 megapixels, the higher capacity battery. That's actually body only, $16.99 right now. If you get it with the kit lens, it's $21.99. Every one of those cameras I've talked about right now come with a free on-demand course, and you get a choice of 3 different ones. So if you're a true beginner, there's something called Photo Foundations that starts with the very basics of photography. If you're a content shooter, like somebody who's shooting to post short form video on Instagram or YouTube, there's a whole course based off of that called the Short Form Video Starter Guide. And then there's a new one, another Canon ambassador that is well known here in Alberta, named Paul Zizka. He worked with Canon and created one called Beyond the Basics, and that has to do with more advanced techniques for photography as well. So if you are a photographer who is already well versed in photography, this will be covering concepts that might be a little bit more advanced for you as well. And then of course, when you start getting into full frame, R8 is $17.99 body only. The kit is $20.99. The R6 now, the R6 Mark I that John was presenting on is an older camera. There's only a few of them left. McLean still has some kits. That's on sale for $30.99 right now. But otherwise, the R6 Mark II came out about a year ago, and that is the newer version of the R6. So same form factor, but it steps up from a 20 megapixel to a 24 megapixel sensor. So still really, really good in terms of low light capability. It's very fast. It shoots 40 frames per second in electronic shutter mode. It's bonkers. But that thing, the R6 Mark II body is $31.49 currently. It also comes with a free LPE6NH battery. Now, the R5, which John had been talking about, that is on sale for $44.99 currently, and there's $300 cash back from Canon after you purchase it. So that is a phenomenal deal right now. And then, of course, for those of us who aspire to get the R3, The R3 is currently $69.99 with $500 cash back. So, and those are just the cameras. I mean, we have a significant amount of RF glass that is on sale as well. The 100 to 500 on sale. There's too many for me to list. So certainly if you are looking at upgrading or getting a camera for somebody in your family, there's a whole host of options along the range of your capability. And pretty much everything's a good deal right now. So John, thank you very much for your expertise on the education and talking about the products as well. You've done my job for me. I appreciate it. And other than that, I want to thank everybody for joining us. So let's get to the Q&A because I know there's a lot of questions. So feel free to put those in the chat.
We got lots of questions here. Is my mic on? Can y'all hear me? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah. So there's still questions pouring in, so we're gonna try and get through all of them. Let's see here. We've got. I think the first one was Erica. All right. Sorry, folks. Here we go. So I am just going to pop it up on the screen here. Erica's asking, what video editing software do you use?
So great question, Erica. I don't actually do a lot of video editing yet. So I currently use good old iMovie on the Apple. I actually just today bought Adobe Premiere Pro. So I upgraded my Adobe subscription to include that because I'm getting a brand new Mac to work on. So I'm going to test it out with Adobe Premiere Pro. So that's what I will be using soon. But yeah, up until now, just using iMovie.
I mean, I will, to iMovie's credit, I mean, I know it's not free anymore, but for a program that started out as just like software that showed up on your computer when you got it, there's nothing wrong with it. It is great stuff. Awesome. Thank you, John. We got a question here from Ken. Do you check your camera gear or carry on board? So when we were talking about flying with your gear.
Yeah. So great question. I definitely carry on board. So I have two different camera packs that have basically all you want to do is make sure the camera pack that you at least have one camera pack that is airline compliant. So I actually use a different airline compliant one than my regular everyday one. So when I'm just driving around in Banff or Canmore or Jasper, etc., I have a different pack than the one that I take online. So if you go into McLean's website or anywhere online, you will see all sorts of different choices that specify that they're airline compliant. So basically just find the one that suits you the best. For a carry-on bag, but I would never check my camera gear. So, and that includes my 500, my 2R5s, my 100 to 500, my 17 to 40, my teleextenders, my batteries, the whole nine. They actually won't let you check your batteries. So, yeah, so everything gets carried on, and it's all very carefully constructed so that you do not go over the weight limit. I actually can get to 23 pounds. So I can get right to the limit with my carry-on bag. With all that, now thanks to the R5s and everything being lighter and smaller and so on.
Yeah, no kidding. Yeah, and if you are on McBain's website and you're not sure if it's airline compliant, you can just pop into the chat and ask the chat, and they'll let you know whether or not the bag you're looking at is airline compliant. So awesome. We got some more questions here. Somebody commenting, I can stand the cold except for my hands. They get painfully cold when I take my gloves off to work my camera. Any tips for that?
Yeah, so first of all, don't take your gloves off to work your camera. So two ways to go about this. Buy heated liners. That can be your sort of go-to. Now, heated liners, when you get below -20, aren't going to be enough to keep your hands warm. You're going to have an outer glove. So I actually go for a full, big, heavy glove. I'll show you. Hang on a second.
It's that time of year. They're already out.
It's that time of year, yeah. I got them handy. So this is my big glove. They're big, huge things. Let's see. What can you see them? There we go. So it's a big, huge thing. So, and you're like, well, how you got to take that off to work your camera? No, I do not. The only thing I have to take this off for is if I have to change a battery or a card. So here's what I did when I first bought my heated gloves. So these last about 6 hours in -40, about 10 hours in -20. I just put them on and would sit and watch a movie or TV, and I'd play with all my camera settings. And I have just, you can train yourself to use big, heavy gloves on these cameras. It's actually not that hard. You got big dials to work with, and shutter button's pretty easy to feel. And you may think initially, oh, this is impossible, but if I can do it, and I'm 6'3" and a big guy with huge hands, then you can definitely do it with big gloves on. So that's what I would recommend. Just train yourself to do it with thicker gloves and get nice heated gloves that keep your hands warm.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, I guess you got to find what works for you, but yeah, that's
yeah. I mean, Costco sells decent brands. There's a company called Ororo, ORORO, that sells good stuff. There's a number of ones on Amazon. Technology is getting really good in that stuff.
Yeah. I mean, like, so McLean, we carry like photo gloves that have like you can pull the fingertips back and use your thumb and finger. So those ones work really well, but not down all the way to like -40. They're still gonna get pretty chilly. So I think a heated glove is a better call. All right. And then you were talking about autofocus types, and we had a comment here saying there are 4 cases. They did follow up saying I should have said on the R5 used for tracking your sensitivity.
It's the same on the R6 and the R7, so I use the auto case.
Okay. Yeah. Awesome. Thank
you. Very rarely do I change it out of the auto case. Yeah. So I let the camera do that for. That's just you get if I was a specialized photographer, and let's say I was doing motorsports or something like that, then there'd be some of the other cases I would use very specifically. But because wildlife photography includes so many different types of action, and you often don't get the opportunity to be switching in and out of these different cases, I just use auto and let the camera do the work for me.
Right. Yeah. Makes sense. Which tracking sensitivity do you use?
I use the 1 notch below average. So whatever that is, like I can't remember how the scale goes, but if it's 1 to 10, I use a 4. Where 10 being most sensitive. Yeah. So I go just a touch below most sensitive.
Is there a reason for that?
No, just what
just where you're comfortable.
What I started doing, and never changed.
All right. We got a question from Shelley here. In reactionary photography, what aperture do you typically use with a long lens?
Totally depends what shutter speed I can get. Yeah. So generally it's wide open.
Like as wide as the lens will go, yeah.
Yeah. Generally, just to get as much shutter speed as possible for that type of photography.
Right.
Yeah. A lot of that is really going to vary depending on the lighting conditions that you're dealing with at that moment.
Like,
right?
If it's bubble netting whales and it's 10 in the morning and there's lots of light, different. Then it might be able to go to f11 and not have to worry too much. I've still got a couple thousand, 2,000th of a second shutter speed. But pretty much every other time, the lens is just wide open. And
not only that, I mean, like let's also keep in mind, like depending on the length of the lens that you're using, like the longer zoom you have, the more important speed on your shutter is paramount, right? Like because I mean, I don't know if you drink coffee like I do, but I shake, and like the more you zoom in, like the more prevalent that kind of has impact on your images, right?
Absolutely,
so you need to combat that. And let alone if you have a camera that doesn't have in-body image stabilization, then that gets more pronounced as well, right? So a lot of different settings.
Absolutely. Awesome. Thank you. Okay, we're just going to keep cruising through here. What about wearing camo when hunter's about? And they followed up by saying, which is now out doing some wildlife photography and run into hunters with bows. Yikes. So do you wear your camo all the time?
I do. Well, no, I don't. Like I said, I don't wear it to the grocery store and stuff. My wife's not a huge fan of it either, but yes and no. It depends on the species a lot of times. I said use camo to your advantage, but photographing a moose, camo makes no difference whatsoever. In fact, it's better if the moose knows that you're there in most cases. Now, if you're doing wildlife photography in an area with hunters, you're going to find it very tough. And I know that is obviously a huge percentage of the Canadian land base. But generally, wildlife photography is easier in protected areas because the animals are not as scared. And and that if you are out, and I do photography out in areas that are hunted. I don't do it during hunting season. I avoid those areas during hunting season. But the rest of the year, I will wear camo in those areas, for wolf dens and things like that, nests and stuff like that. But yeah, when it's actual hunting season, well, like right now, so when I'm out in Canmore up on the benches where there's bow hunters all the time right now, I don't wear camo generally when I'm walking around. I don't really want to get shot.
I would presume, yeah, it just really kind of comes down to making smart decisions. But
right.
In wildlife photography, there's just a whole host of smart decisions that have to be made anyways. Like, you don't want to be one of those photographers that go out there and get the photos in a way that is literally disturbing like the wildlife themselves. And you have to think about the scenario that you're in. So if you're out there shooting something with a camera and somebody is also out there trying to shoot the same thing with a weapon, I would probably want to say steps should be taken to make sure that that kind of cohabitation in that area can happen without you ultimately getting shot.
Yeah.
I would say like do some research and know, because I don't pay attention to when hunting season is. That's not really my. I don't know.
Regardless of where you live, and it doesn't really matter if you're in Nova Scotia, Iowa, or Canmore, you can find parks nearby that have deer, raccoons, skunks, foxes, bears, whatever it might be. Different animals, obviously, in different parts of the country and different parts of the world, but there's always protected areas. Even middle of Winnipeg, there's protected areas that you can go find porcupines and raccoons and even lynx, and so it doesn't really matter where you are. You don't have to lament the fact obviously I'm right beside Banff and Jasper and Kananaskis country, and I've got all these riches at my fingertips, but you all have good areas at your fingertips, whether it's your backyard or whether you have to go down to the city park or whatever.
Yeah, for sure.
Golf courses, by the way, are great areas to go and find coyote dens and nests and nesting birds and things like that, where they're very used to people and there's no hunting.
See, again, never would have thought of that. Golfing is not my bag. All right, moving on. We have a question from Barbara. Any comments on the 6D Mark II? You seem more of a 5D and 1DX kind of shooter, but do you have?
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm going to say it was a great camera.
Still available.
Still available, yes. But compared to the mirrorless, Barbara, I think, and I've already said I'm not doing this as a sell job, but I really do believe that there are shots that wildlife photographers are missing if they're still shooting with the older technology. So it really comes down to if you can afford it or if you can find somebody to buy it for you.
Ultimately, like the 6D, like it's still a pretty capable camera.
Totally.
A lot of the benefits of the mirrorless we've kind of expanded upon today. But ultimately, there are certain people that still will either, by virtue of wanting a DSLR or not being able to afford the new mirrorless technology, one reason or another, like there's still options available. Like there's certain people that prefer having the actual viewfinder look down the barrel of the lens, right? Like in a mirrorless camera, you are looking at a screen when you're looking through the viewfinder. An
electronic,
right? Yeah. And the 6D is still a very capable camera, really good in low light, 26.2 megapixels, still has a 45-point autofocus system, and it's built tough with the LP6NH battery. So it's a nice package. And to be honest, like we still do see a fair amount of sales every month of the R6 Mark or 6D Mark II and the 5D4 as well. So
yeah.
Still excellent.
Yeah, they were great. They were superb cameras. Like almost all of my books are put together from images from the 5D series.
Yeah.
So if you've seen any of my books before or work of mine in the past, that's often what it's from. And the 62 was in that same league.
Mhm.
Yeah. All right. Roger is asking, do you recommend using auto ISO for wildlife? And we did
Sure.
have.
If you're, yeah, if you're, it's a great way to not have to worry too much about your ISO. I personally set mine. I like to manually control mine, just so I have a bit more control over what my aperture and shutter speed are doing, because they work in that perfect triangle together. Triangle. It was a terrible initial triangle. It was more like a diamond. But I mean, if you're a beginner photographer and you're like, oh, what's the triangle he's talking about? Look that up. The relationship between ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. If you control them to some degree, if you control them all manually, great. You have the most control. However, that does limit you a little bit in stuff that happens instantaneously in being able to have your camera ready. So that's why I use aperture priority mode most of the time to set my shutter speed. Again, that sounds backwards, but that's what I do. So I'll pick f4 and then allow my shutter speed to be as high as possible, for instance, and go ISO 2500. And then I know I'm set for early morning for the early light for that lynx walking out across the road in front of me. So any of you that are still a bit confused about this can contact me afterwards and get into a bit more.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Can you tell us a bit about Exposed and what it's all about?
Thanks, Tim. So Tim is one of our ambassadors, putting a little shout out for Exposed there. So Exposed Wildlife Conservancy is a wildlife nonprofit that I co-founded with a fellow out of Edmonton. And we provide a voice for apex predators. In particular, we focus on bears, wolves, cougars, and wolverine, with a little bit of lynx and bobcat thrown in there. And we look at some of the biggest conservation issues related to these apex predators. So things like trapping, trophy hunting, stuff like that we're really trying to get regulations and policy changed. And one of the things I would love to see is more areas that wildlife photographers can go to where they don't have to worry about getting shot, or they don't have to worry about the animals they want to photograph getting shot. Because I think all of you as wildlife photographers are noticing that there's more and more of us crowding into the same areas. We're not getting any new areas. So we need to start having some of these protected areas expanded. So we got a few more areas to go and photograph in, and just so the wildlife has more places to go, where they don't have to worry about being shot or trapped.
Absolutely. That sounds fantastic. June here is asking, can you get any good shots with the EOS RP camera? Would you recommend buying a good lens or investing in a better camera body?
Ooh, good question. Yeah, definitely can. Russ has used those cameras more than I have. Mm-hmm. Do you want to comment on that, Russ, then?
Yeah, sure. I mean, RP is absolutely a capable camera. It's mirrorless. It has a lot of the technology that we've talked about. Ultimately, back in the day with DSLRs and everything, I remember we used to have conversations all the time about how improving the lens really improves the camera. Because ultimately, no matter what sensor you have, like if you don't have the tool that's focusing the light towards the sensor properly, then, you don't get the results that you want, right? When it comes to the RP, I mean, it's a very capable camera. We're still selling it today. It really comes down to where you see the benefit for you and your photography, right? Like if you are fine with the frame rate that comes from an RP, then absolutely improving the lens, like in terms of zoom, might improve your photography as well. But if you find that what you're missing the most is like that 1 in a million shot because you're already got the lenses and you're needing to get a faster frame rate or a better autofocus system, then yes, you may want to look at upgrading the camera itself. Really, I mean, there's a couple different routes that you can go, but ultimately it comes down to what you as a photographer see yourself as needing the most. And you kind of have to prioritize where you want to place your money in terms of improving that specific area. If it's just the straight camera itself that you're finding is lacking in the way that your images are being produced, then yes, you may want to look at things like an R6 or an R5, as John was talking about. But ultimately, if you find that everything like the autofocus system and the frame rate is fine for what you're using right now, then yeah, I would maybe look at lenses too. So
And June, you could, based on the current prices, you could look at something like an R7 right now, which would upgrade your body considerably, particularly for wildlife, without having to break the bank, an R7 or an R10,
Sure.
Or an R8. And then, look at fairly quickly after that, within 6 months, picking up the 200 800. And then you kind of have the best of both worlds. Yep. You'd have the good camera, plus you'd now have a good lens. And you still wouldn't have spent as much as back in the day, even just buying a good camera.
Yep.
So there are ways to kind of get around that. Now, you can go all the way up to R5, and then like me having the prime lenses, and as soon as Canon comes out with whatever comes down the pipe, I'm probably going to be buying it for the next big fancy thing. But most of you out there are going to be fine going a step down from that. R5, 100 to 500, or going that further step down, something like an R7 and that 200 to 800, or that 600 F11 or 800 F11 with 100 to 500, or there's 100 to 400.
That's what I was going to mention as well, which is $799, right?
How much is it?
$799 for the 100 to 400, right?
So that's you could get a couple of those lenses and you're not even coming close to breaking the bank for most.
No, people. And also, I mean, like it comes down to priorities, right? Like, so she mentioned that she had the RP, right? And that's a very capable full frame camera, right? But yeah, if you wanted to get something that's specific for wildlife, and APS-C would serve you just as well, then like John was talking about shooting on an R5 and then getting an R7. Well, you can do the same thing, like from an RP drop down to an R7 or an R10, and you still get that benefit of the 1.6 crop factor that makes all those lenses appear to zoom in. Like it would give you a benefit that way, and you could kind of have two camera system when you're out in the field, one for closer images like the RP, and then one for your far off images with a longer zoom, which would be your APS-C camera with a long zoom on it, right? So it really, again, kind of comes down to you and your habits and where you feel the system needs to be upgraded for you and your photography.
Yeah, and Russ, I really liked your initial comment. Like, what about the RP, or what about what you're shooting with is producing images that you don't like? And it maybe isn't the camera, it maybe is the lens,
Yeah, I mean, I think we all have a habit of, I mean, I do. I always look at the high-end gear because it's the most exciting. It has the most technological breakthroughs in a lot of cases. But, ultimately it comes down to, if I'm looking at investing money into gear, I want to really introspectively look at what my habits are, but also kind of like project out into the next few years. Like, how I shoot right now is probably very different from how I'm going to shoot 4 or 5 years from now, because I know over the last 4 or 5 years of the way that I've been shooting is very different, and not just subject matter, but technique wise as well. And like, hey, I'm a sales rep. Like, I love it when people buy new gear, but ultimately I'm the same way as everybody else. Like, I have to justify the expense. I'm aware that these products are not, they're not everyday purchases for the average consumer, let alone me, and it's like, if I'm going to purchase something, I want to make sure that I'm able to grow with it, right? Like, it's something that benefits now, but it's something that I know as I learn and, shoot with it, I'm going to be able to grow as a photographer. So what I would really recommend to anybody who's looking at a new camera or a new lens is to really kind of like do your research, find out if it's the right tool for you, and think about how you want to grow with it, because that's ultimately what we want you to do with these new gear, is to really kind of further your enjoyment of what we ultimately enjoy, which is going out and taking photos, right? So
yeah, awesome. Okay, more questions here so we don't run out of time. We're already going a little. Okay, no problem. What winter wildlife do you enjoy looking for in the mountains? I did not have much luck last time aside from the elks. So do you have a favorite?
I just mentioned to you guys that I just spent a week looking for wolves and did not see any. So yeah, I mean, it's wildlife photography, right? Winter wildlife that I enjoy looking for. I particularly enjoy lynx, wolves, red fox, moose. This winter, I'm going to be spending most of my time looking for cougars. That's the current project that I'm working on, both as a conservation project for EXPOSED, as well as my own personal book project that I've got going right now. Yeah, I mean, that's just, you just got to, I have a friend that has a saying, you got to put time in the bank before you can make a withdrawal. So you got to just keep going out there over and over and over again. And, you know, bad weather, very cold weather often gets lots of animals moving because they can't just sit still for long, like a minus 25. I'm not talking, if it goes minus 40, then you can probably stay at home too, because animals don't move around much in minus 40, but minus 25, a lot of animals move around a lot because they're trying to stay warm and get some food in them. So
It's awesome.
yeah,
that's a great tip. Thanks. All right. Love your photos. Does Canon ever do a talk about the point and shoot cameras like the SX70? Would love to hear more about them. Russ, can you talk to that?
I mean, that's not a request we get too often. I mean, certainly if that's something that we feel like, you know, generally when we put these on, I work with McLean camera, right? We choose the subjects based off of, you know, what the feedback from the community is. And, you know, so there's no plans right now. But by all means, if that is something that you would like, I would be, you know, I would bring that up with McLean as well. And, you know, we can always consider it in the future. You know, SX70 and point and shoot cameras, we still have them. Not a lot of manufacturers do. You know, not nearly as many as we used to, but SX70 is a good, I don't want to say pocketable because you can't fit it in your pocket, but it's a nice, small, compact 65 times zoom point and shoot camera. Certainly on a different level than what you would find in the mirrorless lineup, but you know, one that a lot of people purchase to take on vacation, etc. So, I mean, if that's something that you're interested in, by all means, you know, speak to McLean, and you know, maybe that's something we can consider in the future for sure.
Yeah, I mean, like the same basic principles still apply, right? So it's still a camera, it's still capturing an image on a sensor. So like you could look at, I mean, McLean does offer intro to photography courses, and all of the same information still
apply.
Yeah, it's still going to apply no matter what size of sensor or, you know, what kind of camera you're using. As long
the rules of photography are a physical thing. It's not, it is nothing that's prioritized to Canon or Nikon or Sony or anything along those lines. Like the triangle that John was talking about is just the basic rules of photography and the relationship between aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. So, you know, an SX70 has manual control, and you can manually control all three of those things as well. Of course, the range of capability is not the same as what you find on DSLRs and mirrorless cameras, but yeah, by all means, like I said, just you know, be in contact with McLean, and you know, maybe we'll consider that in the future for sure.
And of course, in winter, you have to remember that triangle is slightly different. It's got a big gap at the top, and that's where you put the heated stuff.
Yeah, it's a parabola instead. If you are in an area for only a short time, would you prefer hunkering down in a spot with your tripod, or would you prefer to do more of a run and gun style?
Always run and gun. So try and cover ground. So just, if you do not know an area, just randomly sitting somewhere is almost always going to result in you seeing nothing. Because generally we don't know the areas to pick. You know, even me, if I go to an area I'm not familiar with, you know, I can guess what might be the good areas, but I'm just guessing. So instead I would run and gun it and cover as much ground, whether you're on foot or you're in a vehicle or whatever. Now, if you're in a vehicle, you know, you can drive along nice and slowly, or you can drive fairly quickly and try and cover lots of ground, as long as you know you're not speeding. So that's your own technique and your own. Anyone that's been in a vehicle with me, which I've seen a few of the names here have been on trips with me before, know that I cover ground. I try and see as much area as I possibly can. You know, when Russ and I went, we were just covering ground and trying to, you know, just see if there's something near the road on that particular day to be able to test those cameras on.
John, I pulled up the list, and in 8 hours on the road with you that one day, we saw 5 grizzly bears, 5 black bears, many goats, a sheep, a fox, an elk, marmots, ground squirrels, and then the golden mantled ground squirrel.
I think my favorite part of that is that you counted like the black bears but then you said many goats.
Well, it's true though. There was a lot of them that day. A lot of the photos that John showed today was from that actual.
Yeah, it was. Yeah. I only got to test the R7. I've got to test for 4 days. The R6 and the 600 F11 and 800 F11 I got for a day.
That was that
That
day.
was tremendous amount of pressure.
Yeah.
To try and then the R3 I had for 2 weeks and it crapped out after, like, I actually had a prototype.
That was a pre-production.
Before it even comes out, and the autofocus stopped working on the third day. So, which happens with prototypes because it's not a real production model yet.
Yeah.
And but I thankfully got 2 days in of shooting with it.
I saw a question in the chat just come up. He said, "Where was that big day, Russ?" That was literally between Canmore and Jasper. We just went up and down the highway. We'd go around the corner, and there'd be like 2 black bears up in a tree.
Yeah, we left at like 4:30 in the morning. Yeah,
it was crazy.
Wild.
Yeah.
Never happens.
Wild.
Yeah, it was a legendary day.
All right, let's try and get some more questions in here before we have to wrap it up. Can you explain the difference between image stabilizer 1, 2, and 3 on the Canon RF 1 to 500?
John, I'll let you answer this, but if not, I can answer it.
Yeah, so I primarily use 1, 2, shuts off up and down, so allows you to pan with stuff. And then 3, what does 3 do again? 3's
so 1 is general use.
Yeah.
2 is for panning, so it turns off the vertical axis, and then 3 is for erratic behavior. So it's got an algorithm in it that basically is for coffee drinkers like me.
Yeah, I don't ever use 3, but I use 2 sometimes if I have time to. If I have time to remember to switch it, and usually when you're panning something, it's like just happens.
That would be beneficial too for a lot of people who use tripods, I would presume too.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I do still use image stabilization on a tripod though. Great question, Sherry. Glad you're still up.
Yeah. All right. So we're going to hit 2 with 1 stone here. We got a question saying, where do you go to shoot as a beginner? And also we'll throw this one in together with it. Do you have any favorite spots in the Jasper area?
Yes. So as a beginner, the best place to go is, as I was mentioning earlier, local parks, golf courses, things like that.
Yeah.
Places where there's no hunting, and places where the animals are used to seeing people. So kind of the holy grail within Canada is probably Jasper. So when you ask me, do I have favorite places within Jasper, I'd say probably the entire park. It depends what species you're talking about. Yes, there's pretty much every single road you can go in Jasper has countless different species that you can see along it, and different times of year, different things. So I'm not gonna get into very specifics. If you want the very specifics of Jasper, you'll have to come on one of my Jasper workshops or photo tours. Sorry about that, but I'm not going to give away the secrets of. People pay a lot of money to come on those trips, and then I can't just give out all the secrets on a on a call like this. But Jasper in general is fantastic. And then for just beginners, I think just local parks. I grew up in Salmon Arm, and the golf course in Salmon Arm has a great area for nesting grebes, for trumpeter swans at times. It's got a couple nice areas for finding owls. So just using as an example, literally you can be anywhere in Canada. Doesn't matter. You can be right in the dead middle of Vancouver, and you can go to Stanley Park, and there's deer and coyotes and raccoons and swans in the pond, and orcas coming into the bay. And it doesn't really matter where you are. There is wildlife around. Calgary, you get friggin' bobcats walking into people's yards. So.
I'm in Calgary. It's insane. I was driving down the road a couple of months ago, and a bobcat crossed in front of me. Like it's nuts.
So don't use the fact you're not close to Jasper as any kind of an excuse to not be a great wildlife photographer. There's great wildlife photographers in PEI and Newfoundland, Quebec, everywhere.
Absolutely everywhere.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Some people here from Southern Ontario. I grew up in London. There's tons around.
Absolutely. Yeah. And tons of great places in the US. If you live in North Carolina, you're somewhat limited in the big predators and stuff, but that's where you plan a trip to go do, somewhere down the line, you go do an African safari, you come with me to go do grizzlies, something like that. You save up eventually. If it becomes, a hobby you really love, and that's where you want to put some of your money, then down the line you can look at that. But as beginners, I think just going to your local parks and stuff and just finding some of those areas that animals let you get close enough to photograph.
Yeah. Okay, there's lots of sort of, I apologize, folks, if we don't get to your question. I'm not trying to be
so many
rude.
questions.
There's a lot of questions. I'm picking a couple of
Pick
them.
out the good ones. No pressure.
It's not good versus bad. I'm just choosing ones that I think are a little more like apply to the talk tonight. If
sure.
you do have other questions that we didn't answer tonight, please reach out to any one of us three, or McBain Camera. We can hopefully answer all of them. Let's see here. We did have a question about a lens wrap. I don't know if you have a specific one that you use.
Yeah, I use lens coat as my lens wraps. But there's a number of different ones. I generally get a camo one. So whatever you can find that it's camo, just again, if you ever end up at a nest or a den, you can go and you've got that extra little bit of coverage instead of having the white lens stick out.
Yeah. Awesome. We had Shelly ask, what, if any, filters do you like with wildlife photography?
So I personally don't use any filters with wildlife photography, just because I always like to keep that shutter speed. If I need to go high, I can go high instantly. If something really crazy starts happening with severe action, or with intense action. The only one you would really use with any regularity would be a polarizer. So most big lenses or big zooms have a way to put on a polarizer lens, either on the front or dropping it in. So that would cut the glare on water, for instance. So you could use it for photographing waterfowl, whales, things like that. Again, I personally don't, but I know photographers that do. And then I have occasionally, in the past, I occasionally had used a split neutral density filter. Nowadays, if I see a scene where animals in the shade and then the background is too bright or whatever, like that pine marten, and I didn't have time with the pine marten, but if I've got time to do something and set it up, I'll bracket it a little bit and then blend them together afterwards in Photoshop. But that's a lot of work, and it's got to really be, like the Wolverine with 3 kits, walking around and fighting the grizzly, and
because you said you rarely set up and use a tripod, and
no, I do. There are certainly times when I will set up and use a tripod. That's more, the question was, if I don't know an area, will I hunker down or will I move around a lot?
Right.
I move around if I don't know an area. Now, it totally depends what I'm after. If I'm after a beaver and I know where the beaver is, I just go and hunker down and sit there and wait for the beaver to come out and come by where I'm sitting. So it totally depends on the situation, but that would be, that'd be a situation where I'd be using a tripod and I'd be hunkered down and I'd just sit there and wait. A lot of my Kootenai Wolves book was hunkered down, full camo, tripod, big lens, poking through a little hole in the trees, waiting for the wolves to show up at one particular spot.
All right, let's get, I don't know, maybe 2 more questions in. You demonstrated cropping and mentioned file size. Is there a minimum JPEG size you require to share an image? I feel like that's a really technical question.
Yeah, it is. That's a great one, though. Thanks, Mitch. Nice to hear from you. So, it's not really a minimum JPEG size, because JPEGs, you can, for social media, really, to be perfectly honest, like if I had a 45 megapixel R5 picture of my screen right now, me and the cougar in the background and so on, and I just wanted to share on social media, I could crop down to my nose and it would look pretty sharp on social media as just a little JPEG. But for a usable image, if a client comes to me and says, "Hey, John, I saw that shot of yours on Instagram or Facebook. Can I buy a 24 by 36 print? Or can I use that on the side of a bus or on a magazine cover or whatever?" So my standard is a 12 by 18 inch 300 DPI, 300 dots per inch file. And so off the R5, so let's pretend this cougar image behind me on the screen here was full frame 45 megapixel. It's not. I actually cropped in a bit, probably about 30% on this image. But if that was full frame, I could probably crop it to a vertical with just the cougar, and just a little bit around the cougar, and have it so like 18 inches tall and 12 inches wide. And that would be a usable file off the R5 for me. So I could actually crop a lot pretty drastically, and then still make a good 12 by 18 300 DPI file out of it that obviously will, size down and looks great on social media, but is something I can actually send to clients and know they're not going to come back to me and say, oh, that looks terrible, like upsize to that size. So that's how I crop. I crop basically anything I show on Instagram or Facebook. I assume, as a professional, I assume someone might someday want to order that off me at a certain size. And I know my 12 by 18 file, I can blow it up to 24 by 36 and make a great print out of it. Just with, the techniques I know in Photoshop and all that kind of stuff. So that's how I size stuff and how I know how much I can crop. So hopefully that answered it, Mitch. You can follow up with me on that if you have further questions.
Absolutely. Like with any of these, you can follow up.
Yeah.
Let's do.
No, I am going to be in Mexico for the next 5 weeks.
Right.
Getting back to anybody in a timely manner.
We'll close it off. Do you see any questions, Russ, that we should answer here? I don't want to miss any, but I know I'm missing tons.
I haven't looked in a while here, so
no, that's all right.
Quite a bit to go back on there.
Yeah, there's a lot of questions left here, folks. I apologize. We're not going to get to them. I'm just going to keep going in order. I had somebody ask here, do you shoot with a mechanical or electronic shutter?
I do both. Yeah, it depends. Most of the time I shoot mechanical because I like the sound. And I just don't need the 20 frames a second or 30 frames a second. But I do electronic if there's action going on and I have time to change it, or if I need that silent shutter.
Yeah. Awesome. I think we should probably cut it off there because there's just lots of comments and questions here rolling in. I really appreciate this, folks. Thank you for your engagement and for all of these wonderful questions. I'm really sorry that we did not get to all of these questions. Like I have said repeatedly, if there's something you desperately want answered that we did not get to tonight, please reach out to us. We will be more than happy to help answer that. Thank you again from McLean. Thank you, Canon. Thank you, Russell. Thank you, John. Very appreciative of everybody who tuned in tonight, and I look forward to hopefully hosting another event with you, John, in the future. But we'll definitely be seeing more of Canon. They've got some wicked sales on right now, like honestly, wicked sales.
Check those emails. Hey, if you don't get the email in the next 12 hours, let's call it, check your spam folder.
Yeah.
And if not, get in contact with McLean. Yeah,
absolutely. So. Well, I think we're going to close things off. If either of you have any closing comments, please chime in.
I want to thank you, Jolene and McLean. Obviously, thanks for hosting. Thanks for the audience, everybody spending your night with us. I'm sure a bunch of people have probably already left the call, but for those of you who are still here, especially those of you in Ontario, 2 hours ahead of us, thanks for staying this late into your evening with us. John, much appreciated. Nice to see you again. And thank you all. It's been great.
Thanks, everybody.
Terrific. Reach out to workshop@mcbaincamera.com. And if you have any questions, but in the meantime, toodaloos.
Cheers, everybody. Bye-bye.
Take care.